Thank you, James and Renee. We're very happy and we're honored to have with us this morning two scholars from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. We have with us who will be speaking first, Professor W. Fitzhugh Brundage. Professor Brundage is the William Umstead Distinguished Professor. He is the author of Lynching in the New South, Georgia and Virginia, 1880 to 1930, Beyond Blackface, African Americans and the Creation of American Popular Culture, 1890 to 1930, Civilizing Torture, and American Tradition, and a number of other books and articles you will find written by Professor Brundage. We're also very happy to have with us Professor Claude Clegg, who is the Lyle V. Jones Distinguished Professor. He has a joint appointment in African American, and Diaspora Studies at UNC Chapel Hill. He is the author of An Original Man, The Life and Times of Elijah Muhammad, The Price of Liberty, African Americans and the Making of Liberia, and Troubled Ground, A Tale of Murder, Lynching, and Reckoning in the New South. Please join me in welcoming our two speakers this morning. Our first speaker is Professor Brundage.
Good morning. It's an honor for me to participate in this event, and it's also a fascinating experience for me. Just a brief word. When I started work on my research on lynching as a graduate student longer ago than I care to recount, I encountered surprising ignorance about the topic of lynching. There was, of course, my own ignorance, but as I was doing research, I would go to communities in Georgia where lynchings had been commonplace, might be an exaggeration, but there had been an alarming number of lynchings in a particular community. And I would run into people who had no familiarity with that history whatsoever. So I wouldn't say it makes me happy that you all are gathered here to discuss this topic. It's in fact tragic that we gather to discuss this topic, but on the other hand, the very awareness of the history of lynching has spread far beyond the small community of people who were familiar with it before. And I'm leaving aside the lore in the African American community, which was, of course, very rich. I'm talking about a kind of national discussion of lynching. But in the last 20 years, awareness of lynching has really broadened, and our appreciation, if that's the right word for it, our understanding of the role of racial violence in American history has been transformed. So for that reason and many others, it's an honor for me to be here. I thought today I would sort of set the stage for Claude by speaking broadly about lynching not just in the American South, but especially in the American South. And I thought I would concentrate on lynching, if you will, from the perspective of the lynched, and focus on the victims of the lynch mobs, as opposed to talking about the practice as a broad sort of social phenomenon. But I do need to start by talking about when. And we can now chart the rise and fall of lynching, and we can tabulate the mob's toll by day. You know, which days of the week people were most likely to be lynched on, which months most people were lynched in, the years and the decades. So the rough pattern, as you may know, is in the 3 decades after the Civil War, lynchings became a national phenomenon. And I'm referring to lynchings here that concluded most cases, or the intent of the mob was to conclude with the death of the victim. There was a phenomenon before the Civil War of lynching that didn't necessarily end in death. But in any case, in the 3 decades after the Civil War, lynchings became a national phenomenon. Mobs executed horse thieves in Montana, Mexican Americans in Texas, Chinese in California, whites in the Midwest. And in the former Confederacy, lynch mobs augmented the violence of the Reconstruction era. So here, alleged criminals, political insurgents, labor activists, bootleggers, and myriad others died at the hands of vigilantes. After 1890, the geography of lynching took on a marked regional characteristic. To apply an anachronistic term, lynching became largely a Sun Belt phenomenon. The former states of the Confederacy and the states along the Texas, or I should say the Mexican-American border, were the heartland of lynching. Peaking during the 1890s and persisting with a seemingly inexplicable ebb and flow. During the first 2 decades of the new century, lynching only began to become comparatively infrequent in the 1920s. We can now see that downward trajectory of the frequency of lynchings would persist until the practice virtually ceased in the 1950s. But I want us to just keep in mind that contemporaries during the 1930s, the 1940s, and 1950s had cause to be skeptical that the decline of lynching was inexorable. There had always been ebbs and flows in the incidence of lynching. Indeed, one of the invidious aspects of lynching was that it could seemingly happen almost anywhere and at any time. Who would have anticipated that mobs would burn 2 men alive on the outskirts of Philadelphia, or would murder men on the streets of Duluth, Minnesota, or in downtown San Jose, California? And certainly no African American in the United States could be confident that they would not witness yet another lynching, or they might not be the victim of the last lynching. So having charted when lynchings happen, let us now turn to who was lynched. No category of person was safe from the threat of mob violence. Men, women, and pre-adolescent children were executed. Even the unborn were murdered along with their mothers in a few instances. But the large majority of mob victims were men, particularly young men. And by young, I can say this now from my age, I'm talking about men between the ages of, we'll say, 15 and 30. So most of these young men bore the stigma of class, ethnicity, or color. The lynching of a prominent or wealthy white was the exception that proves the rule. The well-to-do and well-connected were not typical mob victims. In those instances that deviated from the norm, the mob's victim lost the protection of wealth and influence because his alleged crime placed him beyond the pale. The obvious example is Leo Frank, the white industrialist murdered by a mob in Georgia in 1915. His religious identity, he was Jewish, rendered his alleged rape and murder of a white Christian girl so offensive in the eyes of the bigots that murdered him that the only punishment appropriate for him, even though he had been convicted and was in prison, was extralegal death. But in the vast majority of the other lynchings, the victim were young men without merit in the eyes of the dominant groups in their communities. They were young men who had offended community standards by bootlegging, by petty thievery, perhaps, by other transgressions. Or they were Chinese laborers whose very being was exotic in the eyes of wary whites. Or they were Italian immigrant men who were allegedly innately insular and crime-prone. Or they were young black men who whites alleged were simultaneously scheming, indolent, violent, criminal, bestial, and oversexed. In short, mob victims were men who could be easily typecast, easily dehumanized. So let me translate these categories into percentages. For the purposes of argument, we can safely assume that at least 4,000 people were murdered between roughly 1880 and 1950. Murdered by lynchers, that is. roughly 75% of that total were black men. To this grim total can be added more than 150 black women whose lives were lost at the hands of mobs. The next largest group of victims were probably Mexican and Mexican-American men. The best extant research has verified more than 500 lynchings of Mexican Americans. But there's reason to believe that many more were lynched, but their deaths have not yet been verified and perhaps never will be. Perhaps nearly as many Euro-American white men were lynched. But of course, that Euro-American category includes, for example, those Italians who were not viewed by old stock white Americans as white in the same way that they were. The victims of lynch mobs, whatever their ethnic identity, were often labeled as vagrants, floaters, or transients. Whether by choice or necessity, many mob victims were typical of the young American of their era in their migratory tendencies. So for example, take the tragic case of 4 young black miners who met their deaths in Clifton Forge, Virginia in 1891. They had migrated from elsewhere in Virginia. The mines were one of the few industrial jobs at that time open to black men. While relaxing after a week working in the mines, they displayed, we might assume, sort of typical masculine bravado by visiting local photographers and posing like Western gunslingers in portraits. And there are amazing photographs of these young men with 2 pistols crossed across their chest. I have no doubt lots of young men at the time had similar pictures taken. Well, as the Saturday afternoon wore on and their boisterous behavior apparently crossed a line, violence ensued, culminating in white casualties. The logic of white supremacy now demanded a lesson be taught and boundaries of deference restored. The execution of the 4 black men may not have been inevitable, but it was entirely predictable. In this and countless other instances, we'll never know if the young black men snapped after deciding they weren't going to take it anymore. They weren't going to take the daily degradations of Jim Crow anymore. That was certainly the case of Robert Charles in New Orleans in 1900. Prior to his death at the hands of a posse, Charles had wandered the Mississippi River Valley and had held no steady job. He was outraged by the sadistic lynching, an incredibly sadistic lynching, of a black man named Sam Hose in Georgia in 1899. And Charles apparently decided that he wasn't going to submit to the abuse at the hands of whites or to allow the police to ever take him without a fight. Before his eventual death, he shot 4 policemen, 2 civilians, and wounded 20 other whites. Well, black men like Charles and the 4 Virginia miners took to the road in pursuit of opportunity or perhaps out of wanderlust. We may not think, for example, that working in a turpentine camp offered much. It was horrible work, as best I can tell, having never done it. But for a young black man, it offered work steady, or I should say steady work, free from white supervision. It also was associated with a kind of rollicking camp life, where black men could gamble and carouse without many of the restraints, the inhibitions imposed by Jim Crow racial etiquette. Of course, those very same qualities bred deep suspicion among whites about black turpentine workers and other migrant workers who literally and figuratively evaded their proper place in the racial hierarchy. Economic necessity also drove black men to migrate across the American hinterland. For example, the timbering of the vast longleaf pine forests that stretched from North Carolina to Texas, the largest continuous forest in what is now the United States, created a moving frontier for decades. Deforestation on that scale required an army of lumbermen who followed the lumber companies as they migrated westward and southward. And all of these lumbermen, these black lumbermen, were of course seen with great suspicion by whites. And then there were the black men who flocked to southern towns and cities looking for lucrative satisfying, or more secure alternatives to farming. Wherever they appeared, black men in motion alarmed whites. Each new black in a community, whether it was a new South city like Roanoke or a Louisiana timber camp, represented a potential violator of local racial norms. The racial etiquette of Jim Crow, contrary to the claims of its architects or its defenders, was not innate to whites or blacks. To the contrary, it had to be taught. It had to be learned. And what was taught and learned in one community might not be the same that was taught and learned in another community. For all these reasons, a mobile black man in the Jim Crow South was always tiptoeing on the knife's edge, whether by commission, omission, or just plain bad luck. At any time, he might violate local racial etiquette and find himself in a life-threatening situation. So what were these life-threatening situations that often culminated in lynchings? What were the alleged offenses for which more than 4,000 people paid with their lives? And I don't want to refer to these as the causes of the lynchings. I would rather refer to them as the pretext for the lynchings, for a reason that should become clear. You don't need me to tell you that the foremost justification, repeated mantra-like by advocates and even some critics of lynching, was retribution for assaults on white women. I'll tell you, back when I first started research on lynching decades ago, people didn't know much about lynching, but they sure knew a lot about the threat, the alleged threat that black men posed to white women in the late 19th, early 20th century South. The image of the black beast rapist who preyed on vulnerable white women and girls was refined during the 1890s. And by the early 20th century, it had become the backstop that quieted any hand-wringing by critics of lynching. The power of the rape accusation was that it drew together many threads of the white supremacy ideology into a single visceral image, as filmmaker D.W. Griffith demonstrated in his landmark melodrama, The Birth of a Nation, a film that captivated the nation in 1915 and later. In the mythic black beast rapist, whites saw evidence of the innate barbarism of black men that justified virtually any steps to quarantine whites from blacks. They also saw evidence of the dangerous social ambitions of African Americans to achieve social equality that had been foolishly stoked in black men by abolitionists and wild-eyed fanatics. No justification of lynching or white anti-black measures was more potent or more compelling to whites than the defense of white womanhood. The myth of the black beast rapist ensured that interactions between black men and white women and children were inherently fraught. A misunderstood glance, a casual touch of a hand, or an insufficient display of deference could all be twisted into evidence of an incipient sexual assault. But we've already lingered long enough on the alleged threat to white womanhood. In fact, allegations of violence against women provided the pretext for fewer than a third of lynchings. In the large majority of cases, the precipitating incident, if you will, the pretext, were escalating arguments and confrontations that culminated in either the death or the wounding of white men. The initial spark may have been as petty as a dispute over a card game or an argument over wandering livestock. In other instances, disputes crossed important lines of authority. A sharecropper's landlord might argue over the terms of a contract or a crop settlement, or the owner of a blind tiger or sort of illegal juke joint might come to blows with the sheriff. If a white lawman was bested or killed by a black man, virtually any level of violent retribution was possible. So too, if a white landlord fared badly in a confrontation with a black man. The preservation of the etiquette of white supremacy made urgent the punishment of these and similar transgressions. Thus, they account for more than half of all lynchings. The remainder of alleged offenses included myriad petty offenses, none of which were capital crimes. These were the cases that anti-lynching activists understandably dwelled on. Such is the case of a 16-year-old boy in Georgia who dropped a nickel in 1916. A nickel in 1916 was real money, especially to a 16-year-old African-American boy in the outback of Georgia. The daughter of his white employer, who was younger than he was, snatched up the coin. When he compelled her to return it, she fled crying to her parents. In short order, the boy was accused of attempting to assault the girl, an accusation that led to his death at the end of a rope. As this example illustrates, understanding the internal logic of lynching cannot adequately answer the pressing question of why lynchings became so pervasive, so commonplace in the United States. Instead, we need to turn our attention to a deeper explanation. So to answer why, we can't look to the pretext, the alleged crimes that precipitated the lynchings. That doesn't explain it. That's the justification, again, the pretext. To answer why, I think, we have to find in the toxic combination of our nation's tradition of dispersed authority and white racial privilege. The term dispersed authority may seem like a really awkward, cumbersome, opaque term to refer to divided government, federalism, and the features of our lowercase Republican form of government. But I use the term to draw attention to one of the most significant consequences of our system of government. So keen were the nation's founders to establish a polity free of the threat of despotism that they dispersed power as widely as was compatible with the security of their property and their interests. Among the consequences of this dispersal of authority is the obligation that it imposed on each citizen and each community to preserve its law and order. The preservation of law and order was borne by each citizen, in other words, by each community. If it was a charge to public duty, it was also a license to vigilantism. Dispersed authority may have ensured that the nation was free from dictators, but across the nation, sheriffs and local law officers could wield power like petty tyrants. Likewise, dispersed power granted to the slave master, this was by intent, extraordinary power over his human chattel. Emancipation constrained some of the landlord's powers, but long after the abolition of slavery, white employers presumed the right to deal with their laborers as they saw fit. When the obligation and license of dispersed power was then combined with a violent commitment to preserve white racial privilege, almost any action could be justified in the name of defending Anglo-Saxon civilization. White Southerners periodically argued over where to draw the line in their resort to extra-legal violence. Editorial pages were consumed by these debates. Even otherwise callous defenders of lynching recoiled at some instances of public torture and the cremation of lynching victims. But for all of their efforts to calibrate the jurisdiction of lynch mobs, such debates were largely irrelevant, because in the end, the only meaningful restraint on mob violence was the conscience of the lynchers themselves. After all, 2/3 of Southern lynching victims were seized from law officers. And yet almost no lynchers were ever prosecuted. So there was no threat of prosecution if you participated in a lynching. So as long as white Americans perpetuated the dispersed authority they inherited from the founders and embraced the ideology of white supremacy, parlor debates about good and bad lynchings did little to limit or delegitimize lynching. And lynching remained bred in the bone in the United States. Thank you.